Hi everyone, I'm George Jackson with GovExec TV, host of today's 5 Questions with Adam Clater, Chief Architect over at Red Hat. Adam, it's been a while. Great to see you again, sir.
It has been. It's good to see you in this lovely morning. So thanks for scheduling the weather as well.
Indeed. Beautiful. Red Hat, deeply involved with open source communities. You've been in this space for a number of years. Talk about the maybe evolution and where open source is today, how people are leveraging it.
Absolutely. So open source communities have really evolved from what I think people may traditionally think of. They're not really the loose sort of ragtag organizations you might think of. We've got significant involvement from corporate contributors like Red Hat, obviously, IBM, Google, Microsoft. I mean, every major mover in the IT industry today is contributing to open source communities. So what we find is that the evolution of capabilities in technology are happening much, much faster. So I think traditionally people may have thought about open source communities as sort of a commoditization engine. I want to make something that's like something else, and so I'm going to do that in an open way. Today, really, open source communities are the drivers of innovation. Things like cloud, things like AI, these could not have happened without open source technologies, and they're fundamentally built on open source technologies.
VM was an acronym, admittedly, I had to look up before this interview.
Sure.
Virtual machine for the audience's benefit there, but federal agencies, educational institutions, why is VM an important acronym to track these days?
Yeah, so virtualization has been a cornerstone not only of cloud, but of other efforts that we've seen in the federal marketplace, like data center consolidation, cost savings. So when we think about the late 90s to early 2000s, you would buy a data center, or you would lease a data center, you would fill it with equipment, you would build the network, you would pay for the power, and each server that you had corresponded to a physical machine within your data center. Virtualization comes onto the scene, and we see a consolidation of 10 to 1 or more. So 10 physical machines now become virtual machines, taking up 1 physical machine. And so that led to a lot of cost savings in federal and commercial space. That happened it became really significant in the early teens. We saw a lot of those migrations happening. And what has happened is that virtualization as a technology didn't stand still. It continued to evolve, and open source communities saw what was happening in virtualization, especially with proprietary commercial vendors, and said, well, we can do that too. And so virtualization has actually been built into the Linux kernel for over a decade now. Red Hat's been shipping it as part of our enterprise Linux distribution for all of that time. And now we're seeing some changes in the virtualization marketplace. And so customers, especially on the federal side, are starting to take a look at their legacy virtualization implementation and ask questions, whether it be for cost or whether it be for mission, about whether or not they need to continue down the path that they've been on for the last decade. And so a lot of them are now looking at making changes, and it's ripe because the opportunity to change your virtualization implementation is really here, and the technology has changed dramatically from what you may have used a decade ago.
I'm going to ask you a long-winded question here, Adam, but I promise at the end of this particular rainbow, there is a question.
All right.
Risk mitigation, nothing new for the public sector, but with all of those advances that you lay out, a more open source approach, virtual machines, like contingency planning, resiliency, does that look different than it used to look? Like, how do you advise government organizations, how do you advise agencies to do that resiliency, that contingency planning?
Yeah, good question. So historically, contingency planning meant, when I was working with the Army, I used to work for Lockheed Martin, I was working with the Army. We had a data center in Alexandria, and then we had another data center maybe in Fort Huachuca, right? And so we would do these exercises where folks would fly out to the other base and they would stand up a carbon copy of the infrastructure that we had in Alexandria, just to make sure that that continuity of operations, that COOP planning, was working. And so that was a really significant, really expensive exercise because you had government folks, you had contractors, you had hardware, you had the footprint. All of that stuff was like living there, whether you were using it or not. So fast forward to today, and government agencies have a lot of options when it comes to resiliency and redundancy planning. You can have something living in your data center, and you can decide that your failover is going to be to the cloud. You can have something living in your data center, and you can decide that you're still going to do that traditional failover. Or you can build your applications in such a way that they're just sort of internally resilient, but at the end of the day, if the power gets cut and you don't have any more left, you have to have a plan. And so those plans have evolved significantly. The parts of that risk mitigation plan are going to really be dependent on how your application is built and architected. And so if that application is built and architected in the legacy model, where the only way to rebuild it is to build it again somewhere else from the ground up, then there's going to be a cost associated with that. But the reality is there's been a lot of modernization of applications and infrastructure, and it's totally viable for a government agency to say, I'm going to build and run my application in my data center, and I'm going to fail to the cloud, or I'm going to build and run in the cloud, I'm going to fail to another cloud, or I'm going to fail back to my data center. It's really become much more of a three-legged stool. And so we spend a lot of time working with customers to figure out what that hybrid solution is going to be, because they're all taking that into consideration, but it's all part of their planning as well. And that's a big part of Red Hat's role in helping our customers.
At the end of the day, you're talking about more effective management.
Absolutely.
You have a solution called OpenShift Virtualization. Tell me about it. How does it address something like that?
Sure. So while the proprietary world was, I'm going to say, resting on their laurels a bit of virtualization, they were really happy with what they've done. Open source communities continued to evolve the concepts of virtualization and what it meant. So we have this thing called kernel virtual machine, kernel-based virtualization. The hypervisor is built right into the operating system. But while that's happened, there's been a whole litany of technologies that have also come onto the scene, like containerization, like Kubernetes, like security enhanced Linux. And so what open source communities and Red Hat's contribution have really led to is the idea that this virtual machine doesn't need to live on this old legacy infrastructure any longer. We can actually run that virtual machine side by side with our brand new applications in our Kubernetes environment, and we can take advantage of the resiliency of that Kubernetes platform. And so that's what OpenShift is. OpenShift is Red Hat's Kubernetes platform. So we can take advantages of the new technology in the Kubernetes platform while still running that legacy workload right next to our modern, brand spanking new applications. So it's really become a hybrid implementation of those technologies, and they get to really bring the best of both. And so that means that we can have a Linux virtual machine, a Windows virtual machine, and a Kubernetes application all running in the same infrastructure. And when we start to think about planning and resiliency, it's how do I move workloads from one place to another, not how do I rebuild my virtual machine infrastructure in that other place.
Kubernetes, for the record, one of my favorite words in the public sector IT landscape. So translate that to mission value.
Absolutely.
Adam.
Yeah.
What does it look like?
So the great thing about Kubernetes is that we can build Kubernetes as big as a data center, or we can build Kubernetes as small as a drone. But what that means is that for those developers and for those workloads, they don't have to retool and refigure out how those applications are going to work depending on where they're going to live. So we are literally working with system integrators and government agencies to put Kubernetes on drones, but the application developers can do all of their development on their laptop and then ship that wherever it needs to be. This has been tremendously effective for our customers. So if you can imagine wherever your mission is going to take you, Kubernetes and Linux and your application workloads are going to be able to be there so that we can meet the needs of your very specific mission.
Red Hat Chief Architect Adam Clater, always a pleasure, sir.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning in to today's 5 Questions. For GovExec TV, I'm George Jackson. Have a great day.